Effective immediately, Penny will be taking over your position, my husband Quincy announced in the conference room, his arm casually draped around his secretary's shoulders. We need someone more dynamic in this role. I smiled calmly, gathered my belongings, and walked out without a word. What neither of them knew was that I was the one who had personally hired Penny 3 months ago, and she was about to discover exactly why. The fluorescent lights of Sterling and Associates' main conference room buzzed overhead as I sat at the polished mahogany table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Surrounded by faces I'd worked alongside for the past 8 years, the monthly department review meeting had been routine until this moment, until my husband walked in with her. Penny Clearwater stood beside Quincy like she owned the place, her perfectly manicured red nails drumming against a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her blonde hair was styled in that effortless way that actually took hours to achieve, and her smile held just enough warmth to seem genuine to anyone who didn't know better. But I knew better. I knew exactly who Penny Clearwater was, where she came from, and most importantly, why she was here. Good morning, everyone, Quincy began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd perfected over years of climbing the corporate ladder. As the newly appointed regional director of our marketing firm, he commanded attention wherever he went. What most people in this room didn't realize was that his promotion had been orchestrated by someone much more powerful than his charming personality and MBA from State University, me. I've called this special meeting to announce some exciting changes to our team structure, he continued, and I watched as several colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Corporate restructuring rarely meant good news for employees. As you all know, we've been evaluating our senior marketing positions to ensure we have the most qualified candidates in leadership roles. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I was calculating exactly how this scene would unfold. After all, I'd written the script myself, though neither Quincy nor Penny realized they were simply following my directions. Maureen, Quincy said, turning his attention to me with what he probably thought was a professional demeanor, your dedication to this company over the past 8 years has been adequate. However, we need to make some strategic changes to stay competitive in today's market. Adequate. The word hung in the air like a slap. Around the table, my colleagues, people I'd mentored, projects I'd led to success, campaigns I'd developed that had brought in millions in revenue, stared at their notepads or coffee cups, suddenly fascinated by anything that wasn't my face. Effective immediately, Quincy continued, his arm moving to rest casually around Penny's shoulders in a gesture that was supposed to look supportive, but screamed intimate. Penny will be taking over your position as Senior Creative Director. We need someone more dynamic in this role, someone who can bring fresh perspectives and innovative thinking to our client relationships. The irony was delicious. If only he knew that Penny's fresh perspectives and innovative thinking were exactly what I'd been counting on when I personally recruited her from our competitor 3 months ago. Penny stepped forward slightly, her voice smooth as silk. I'm excited to work with such a talented team, she said, making eye contact with each person around the table except me. I know there will be an adjustment period, but I'm confident we can achieve great things together. Sam Rodriguez, my former assistant and one of the few people in the room with genuine integrity, looked genuinely shocked. But Maureen built the entire creative division, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's brought in over 60% of our major accounts, and we're grateful for her contributions, Quincy replied smoothly, though his jaw tightened slightly. He'd never liked being questioned, especially not in front of others. However, it's time for new leadership. Maureen will be transitioning to a consulting role with significantly reduced responsibilities. A consulting role, that was corporate speak for we're pushing you out, but don't want to deal with a wrongful termination lawsuit. I stood slowly, my chair rolling back with a soft whisper against the carpet. The room fell silent except for the persistent hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street 20 floors below. Every eye was on me, waiting for tears, protests, or the kind of emotional breakdown that would make them all feel uncomfortable and superior. Instead, I smiled. Not the fake corporate smile I'd perfected over years of client meetings and budget presentations, but a genuine expression of amusement that seemed to unsettle Quincy more than any tantrum could have. "Congratulations, Penny," I said, my voice steady and warm. "I'm sure you'll find this position very educational." I gathered my things with deliberate calm, my tablet, my coffee mug with World's Best Marketing Director, printed on the side a gift from the team after we'd landed the Morrison Industries account, and the small succulent plant that had lived on the conference table for 3 years. Maureen Drew Martinez, our head of accounts, started to say something, but I held up a gentle hand. "It's perfectly fine, Drew. Change is inevitable in business." I tucked my tablet into my purse and smiled at him. "Besides, I have a feeling this transition will work out exactly as it's supposed to." As I walked toward the door, I paused next to Penny. Up close, I could see the foundation caked a little too thick around her hairline, the way her hands trembled slightly despite her confident posture. She was nervous, which was understandable. After all, she was about to discover that the job she thought she'd secured through charm and strategic positioning had actually been handed to her by the very woman she was replacing. "Good luck," I whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "I think you're going to need it more than you realize." The confusion that flickered across her face was perfect. She had no idea what I meant, but something in my tone clearly unsettled her. I walked out of Sterling and Associates' gleaming lobby with my head held high, nodding politely to the security guard who'd watched me come and go for nearly a decade. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor, a sound that had once represented power and purpose, and now marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of something far more interesting. In my purse, my phone buzzed with a text message. I didn't need to look to know it was from my attorney, confirming that the final pieces of my plan were falling into place. By tomorrow morning, Quincy and Penny would understand exactly what they'd walked into. And by tomorrow afternoon, they'd realize that firing Maureen Sterling had been the biggest mistake of their professional lives. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I allowed myself one genuine laugh. After months of careful planning, strategic positioning, and patient manipulation, the real show was finally about to begin. Poor Penny had no idea she'd just been handed the starring role in her own destruction. My name is Maureen Sterling, and most people would describe me as the perfect corporate wife. Supportive, well-educated, professionally accomplished but not threatening to my husband's ego. What they don't know is that I'm also the silent majority shareholder of Sterling and Associates, the marketing firm where this little drama just unfolded. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding how I got here is crucial to appreciating just how thoroughly Quincy and Penny are about to be destroyed. 12 years ago, I was Maureen Chen, a Harvard MBA with a trust fund inheritance of $4.7 million, and absolutely no interest in sitting on charity boards while my husband climbed someone else's corporate ladder. When I met Quincy Sterling at a networking event in downtown Chicago, he was charming, ambitious, and completely broke. He'd just been laid off from his marketing coordinator position at a mid-tier agency, living in a studio apartment that smelled permanently of takeout containers and broken dreams. But he had something I found intriguing: genuine passion for creative marketing, and the kind of hungry desperation that makes people work twice as hard as their comfortable competitors. "I'm going to start my own firm," he told me on our third date, his eyes lighting up as he sketched campaign concepts on cocktail napkins. "Something different, not just selling products, but creating experiences, making brands feel like they're part of people's lives." Most women would have seen the red flags: unemployed, no savings, big dreams but no concrete plan. I saw an opportunity. Within 6 months we were married. Within 8 months I had quietly funded the startup costs for Sterling and Associates using my inheritance, structured through a complex web of LLCs and investment vehicles that my trust fund attorney, Evelyn Blackwood, had designed to protect my interests. Quincy never knew the money came from me. As far as he understood, I'd helped him secure a business loan through my connections. The firm thrived under what Quincy believed was his leadership, but what was actually my strategic guidance whispered during pillow talk and casual dinner conversations. I suggested the office location in the prestigious downtown district. I recommended the initial client targets based on market research I'd conducted but presented as hunches. I even ghost wrote his first major pitch presentation while he was sick with food poisoning. For 8 years, I played the role of supportive wife perfectly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I took a mid-level position at the company to help out and learn the business, carefully keeping my actual qualifications and ownership stake hidden. I watched Quincy take credit for every innovation I suggested, every strategic decision I guided him toward, every major account I helped him land. And I was content with that arrangement, believe it or not. The company was growing exponentially, we were building a life together, and I genuinely believed we were partners in every sense of the word. I thought he respected my contributions, even if he didn't know their full scope. That illusion shattered exactly 6 months ago. I'd been working late on the Hartwell Industries proposal, a potential $12 million account that would make Sterling & Associates a major player in the Chicago market. The office was empty except for the cleaning crew, and I was in the conference room spreading out campaign mock-ups when I heard voices from Quincy's corner office. "She has no idea how replaceable she's become," Quincy was saying, his voice carrying that casual cruelty I'd never heard directed at me before. "Maureen thinks she's indispensable, but honestly any competent marketing manager could do her job." I froze, recognizing the second voice as Penny Clearwater, who had started as Quincy's executive assistant 3 weeks earlier. Her laugh was like glass breaking. It must be exhausting, having to pretend her basic contributions matter. When I worked at Morrison Creative, we would have eaten someone like her alive. Morrison Creative, our biggest competitor, the firm that had been systematically stealing our smaller clients for the past 2 years. "The thing is," Quincy continued, and I could hear the sound of fabric rustling, chairs creaking, intimate movements I didn't want to interpret, "she's served her purpose. Her family connections helped get us established, but now that we're stable, I need someone with real vision. Someone who understands what it takes to compete at the next level. Someone like me," Penny whispered, and even through the wall I could hear the smugness in her voice. "Exactly like you. You understand ambitious men, Penny. Maureen just doesn't get it anymore. She's content with small wins and safe strategies. I need a partner who thinks bigger." Partner. The word hit like a physical blow. I was his wife, his business partner in every way except the ways that mattered to him. And he was discussing replacing me with his secretary, like I was an outdated piece of office equipment. "What about the personal situation?" Penny asked, and I knew exactly what she meant. "Marriage has been dead for years. We're like roommates who share a bed occasionally. Once I make my move professionally, the personal stuff will sort itself out. These things always do." That night, I went home and poured myself a very large glass of wine. Then I opened my laptop and began researching everything I could find about Penny Clearwater. What I discovered was fascinating. She hadn't just worked at Morrison Creative Monge, she'd been their lead industrial espionage specialist, responsible for infiltrating 3 competitor firms over the past 5 years. Her resume was a masterclass in corporate sabotage disguised as career advancement. She was very good at her job, which meant she was very dangerous to people who didn't know what she was. But I'd always been exceptionally good at turning other people's expertise to my advantage. So I made a decision that night, sitting in my home office, surrounded by wedding photos and 8 years of shared memories. If Quincy wanted to replace me with someone he thought was more dynamic, I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would personally ensure that Penny Clearwater became my replacement, and then I would watch both of them discover why that was the worst mistake they could possibly have made. The next morning, I began implementing a plan that would take 6 months to execute perfectly. Every piece had to be precisely positioned, every move had to look natural, and most importantly, both Quincy and Penny had to believe that everything happening was entirely their idea. Today, watching Penny stand beside my husband as he dismissed me from the company I actually own, was the culmination of the most sophisticated revenge plot I'd ever orchestrated. And we were just getting started. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 6 months before today's conference room confrontation. I can still remember every detail with crystal clarity. The smell of stale coffee in the office air, the sound of rain against the windows, and the way my entire world shifted when I heard those voices coming from Quincy's office. I'd been staying late to finish the Hartwell Industries campaign proposal, a massive account worth $12 million annually that could transform Sterling and Associates from a regional player into a national powerhouse. The presentation was due the next morning, and I was perfectionist enough to want every detail flawless. The building was practically empty at 9:30 p.m. Security had made their rounds, the cleaning crew was working the lower floors, and even our most dedicated workaholics had gone home to their families. I was alone in the main conference room, surrounded by mood boards, demographic charts, and campaign mock-ups that represented months of strategic planning. That's when I heard her laugh. It wasn't the polite professional chuckle Penny used during meetings or client calls. This was intimate, throaty, the kind of laugh shared between lovers who think they're completely alone. My hand froze halfway to my coffee cup as the sound drifted through the thin walls separating the conference room from Quincy's corner office. "You're terrible," Penny's voice carried clearly through the ventilation system, her tone playful and seductive. "What if someone hears us? Everyone's gone home," Quincy replied, his voice deeper than usual, roughened by desire. "Besides, we deserve a little celebration after landing the Morrison account." The Morrison account, my blood went cold. Morrison Creative had been trying to poach that client for 6 months, and we'd just signed them to a 3-year exclusive contract last week. I'd personally developed the entire pitch strategy, identifying their pain points and crafting solutions that our competitors couldn't match. Penny murmured, and I could hear the rustle of clothing, the creak of leather furniture being used for purposes other than business discussions. "I have to admit, when you asked me to gather intelligence on Morrison's weak points, I wasn't sure my old contacts there would come through. But having inside information made your pitch irresistible." Inside information, intelligence gathering. The words hit me like physical blows as the pieces fell into place. Penny hadn't just been Quincy's executive assistant for the past month. She'd been feeding him proprietary information from our biggest competitor. "That's what I love about you," Quincy said, his voice moving closer to wherever Penny was positioned. "You understand what it takes to win in this business. Maureen thinks success comes from hard work and playing by the rules. She has no idea how naive that is." I gripped the edge of the conference table, my knuckles white against the polished wood. They were talking about me like I was a child who didn't understand the adult world of business. Like 8 years of building this company alongside him meant nothing. "Speaking of Maureen," Penny said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, "when are you going to make your move? I can't keep pretending to be your innocent little secretary forever. Some of the staff are starting to ask questions about why I'm in your office so much." "Soon," Quincy replied. "The succession plan is already in motion. I've been documenting performance issues, building a case for restructuring her role. By the end of the quarter, she'll be transitioned to a consulting position with minimal responsibilities." Performance issues. I'd brought in more revenue than any other senior manager for 3 consecutive years. My client retention rate was 97%. The campaigns I'd developed had won industry awards and been featured in Marketing Today magazine. And personally, Penny pressed, "I'm getting tired of sneaking around like we're teenagers. When do I get to be the woman by your side, instead of hiding in the shadows?" There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence that speaks volumes. When Quincy finally responded, his words shattered what remained of my marriage. "Honestly, the marriage has been dead for years. We're more like business partners who happen to share a house. Maureen's a good person, but she doesn't challenge me anymore. She's content with mediocrity, with safe choices. I need someone who understands ambition, who pushes me to think bigger." "Someone like me," Penny whispered. "Exactly like you. You get it, Penny. You understand that sometimes you have to take risks, bend rules, do whatever it takes to succeed. Maureen would never approve of using your Morrison contacts, but look how perfectly it worked out." I sat there in the dark conference room, surrounded by the remnants of campaigns I'd poured my heart into, listening to my husband and his mistress plan my professional and personal destruction. They talked about me like I was an obstacle to be removed, an inconvenient remnant of Quincy's past that needed to be discarded now that he'd outgrown the need for my contributions. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the casual cruelty of it. The dismissive way they discussed 8 years of marriage, the contempt in their voices when they talked about my work ethic and values. To them, I wasn't even worth the dignity of an honest conversation about our problems. There's just one thing that concerns me, Penny said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. What if she fights back? Maureen's not stupid, and she has connections in the industry. If she decides to cause problems, Quincy laughed, a sound I'd once found charming, but now recognized as arrogant and dismissive. Maureen! She'll probably cry for a few days, maybe call her sister for emotional support, but she won't fight. That's not who she is. She's always been conflict-averse, always tries to keep the peace. Besides, what could she really do? She's a mid-level marketing manager with a decent track record, but she doesn't have any real power. No real power, if only he knew. I gathered my materials with trembling hands, my mind already racing through the implications of what I'd overheard. They'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The Morrison account victory that I'd thought was our shared triumph had actually been achieved through corporate espionage and betrayal. As I quietly packed my briefcase, I could hear them moving around in Quincy's office, their conversation shifting to more intimate topics that I had no desire to overhear. I slipped out of the conference room like a ghost, my heels silent against the carpeted hallway. The elevator ride down to the parking garage gave me exactly 90 seconds to process what had just happened and decide how to respond. By the time I reached my car, I'd made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. If Quincy thought I had no real power, he was about to discover just how wrong he could be. And if Penny Clearwater wanted to play games with industrial espionage and strategic betrayal, I would show her what those tactics looked like when employed by someone who actually owned the playing field. That night, I drove home through the rain and began planning the most comprehensive revenge in corporate history. They wanted to see what I was really capable of when pushed to my limits. They were about to find out. The drive home that rainy Tuesday night was the longest 23 minutes of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my wedding ring left indentations on my fingers, and I had to pull over twice because my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall completely. By the time I reached our brownstone in Lincoln Park, the house I'd helped purchase with my trust fund money that Quincy believed came from a family loan, I'd made a decision that would either be brilliant or completely destroy me. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, but on my terms. The house felt different as I walked through the front door, like I was seeing it through new eyes. The hardwood floors we'd refinished together during our second year of marriage, the kitchen where we'd hosted dinner parties for potential clients, the home office where Quincy worked on weekends, while I provided strategic input he'd later present as his own ideas. Everything looked the same, but the emotional landscape had shifted completely. This wasn't our shared sanctuary anymore. It was evidence of an 8-year con game, where I'd been both the mark and the unwitting accomplice. I poured myself a glass of the Bordeaux we'd been saving for our 9th anniversary, and sat down at my laptop. If Quincy and Penny thought they could outmaneuver me using corporate espionage and strategic manipulation, they were about to discover what those tactics looked like when employed by someone with actual resources and legal protection. The first step was research. I needed to understand exactly who Penny Clearwater was, where she'd come from, and what weaknesses I could exploit. Her LinkedIn profile was impressive, but vague. 5 years at Morrison Creative in strategic consulting, a business degree from Northwestern, glowing recommendations that were just generic enough to seem suspicious. But I had advantages that most people don't when conducting background research. My trust fund attorney, Evelyn Blackwood, had connections throughout Chicago's legal and business communities that money couldn't buy. More importantly, she specialized in protecting wealthy families from exactly the kind of sophisticated fraud that I was beginning to suspect Penny represented. I called Evelyn at 10:30 p.m., knowing she'd answer despite the late hour. We'd been friends since law school, and she understood that emergency calls from me were never trivial. "Maureen," she said without preamble, "this better be good. I was in the middle of a very promising episode of a true crime documentary. I need a complete background check on someone," I said, settling into my desk chair. "Professional, personal, financial, everything you can legally access and some things you probably can't." There was a pause. Evelyn knew me well enough to recognize when I was operating in crisis mode. "What happened?" I gave her the abbreviated version: the overheard conversation, the industrial espionage, the casual dismissal of our marriage, and my professional contributions. As I spoke, I could hear her taking notes, her lawyer brain already identifying the legal implications and strategic opportunities. "Penny Clearwater," she repeated when I finished. "And you said she worked at Morrison Creative for 5 years in strategic consulting." That's what her resume claims. Interesting. I handled a case last year involving Morrison Creative and alleged theft of proprietary client information. The settlement was sealed, but I remember the defendant was a female employee in their consulting division who'd been systematically gathering intelligence on competitors. My pulse quickened. Was she prosecuted? The case was settled out of court with a significant non-disclosure agreement. But if it's the same person, Evelyn trailed off, and I could hear her keyboard clicking. "Give me 48 hours. I'll have everything you need to know about Miss Clearwater's professional history and personal vulnerabilities." After hanging up with Evelyn, I opened a bottle of wine and began planning the most sophisticated manipulation campaign of my career. If Quincy wanted to replace me with someone dynamic and ambitious, I would personally deliver exactly the right candidate. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. I wouldn't fight Penny's infiltration of Sterling and Associates. I would facilitate it. I would make it so appealing and seemingly natural that both she and Quincy would believe it was entirely their idea. But first, I needed to understand the legal landscape I was working within. I spent the next 3 hours reviewing the corporate documents that Evelyn had structured when I'd funded Sterling and Associates. The ownership arrangements were complex but ironclad. I held 51% of voting shares through a network of LLCs, while Quincy controlled day-to-day operations through his 49% stake and his position as CEO. However, there were specific clauses that Evelyn had insisted on including, protective measures that I'd thought were excessive at the time, but now recognized as brilliant foresight. If Quincy attempted to remove me from my position without cause, or if he engaged in activities that materially damaged the company's reputation or financial stability, my ownership stake would automatically convert to 75% of voting shares. More importantly, any employee discovered to be engaging in industrial espionage or corporate sabotage could be terminated immediately, with the company retaining the right to pursue criminal charges and civil remedies. I smiled as I read those clauses. Evelyn had built a legal fortress around my interests, anticipating threats I'd been too trusting to imagine. The next morning, I implemented phase 1 of my plan. I arrived at the office early and made 2 strategic phone calls that would set everything in motion. The first was to Marcus Webb, the head of strategic recruitment at Morrison Creative. Marcus and I had maintained a professional relationship despite our company's competitive status, and I knew he'd be intrigued by what I was about to propose. "Maureen," he said, clearly surprised to hear from me. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I have a proposition that might interest you," I replied, keeping my voice casual. "We're looking to hire someone with deep institutional knowledge of Morrison's client strategies and campaign methodologies. Someone who could help us understand your competitive advantages and possibly anticipate your moves in joint pitches." There was a long pause. In corporate speak, I just asked him to recommend a spy. "That's an interesting request," Marcus said carefully. "What kind of position are we talking about?" "Executive assistant level initially, but with clear advancement opportunities for the right candidate. Someone who's ambitious, understands the strategic value of information, and isn't overly concerned with traditional ethical boundaries." "I might know someone," he said slowly. "Penny Clearwater. She left us recently after some philosophical differences about company policies. Brilliant strategist, very ambitious, and she has extensive knowledge of our client base and methodologies." Perfect. I was going to recruit the spy who was already targeting my company, making it look like it was my husband's idea to hire her. "Could you arrange an introduction?" I asked. "Perhaps mention that Sterling and Associates might be a good fit for someone with her particular skill set." The second call was to a private investigator that Evelyn had recommended, someone who specialized in corporate security and employee background verification. I wanted complete surveillance on both Quincy and Penny from the moment she started working at our company. "I need documentation of everything," I told the investigator. "Every meeting, every phone call, every email. If they're planning to steal proprietary information or sabotage the company, I want evidence that will hold up in court. By lunchtime, I'd set in motion a plan that would take 6 months to execute perfectly. Penny would be recruited to Sterling and Associates, apparently at my suggestion but actually at her former employer's recommendation. She would systematically infiltrate our company, gathering intelligence and building influence with my husband. And I would document every single move they made, building an airtight case for corporate espionage, while positioning myself to take complete control of the company when their inevitable betrayal reached its conclusion. The most delicious part was that they would both believe they were manipulating me, when in reality, I was orchestrating their destruction from the very beginning. I just had to be patient enough to let them hang themselves with the rope I was providing. Evelyn's research came back faster than I'd expected, and the information was even more damaging than I'd hoped. I met her for lunch at the Union Club, a private establishment downtown where conversations couldn't be overheard and business was conducted with the kind of discretion that only old money could buy. "Your instincts were right," she said, sliding a thick manila folder across the white tablecloth. "Penny Clearwater is a professional corporate infiltrator. What you overheard wasn't her first rodeo, it was just her most recent job." I opened the folder carefully, scanning documents that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning 5 years. Bank records, employment verification forms, legal settlements, and most damning of all, FBI surveillance reports from an ongoing investigation into corporate espionage networks. "She's done this at least 4 times, Evelyn continued, keeping her voice low despite the private setting. "The pattern is always the same. She gets hired as an executive assistant or junior manager, develops relationships with key decision-makers, gathers proprietary information, and then either steals major clients or sells trade secrets to competitors." The documentation was meticulous. At Hartwell Communications, she'd stolen their entire client database and their top-performing creative team before jumping to a rival firm. At Morrison Creative, she'd been suspected of leaking campaign strategies to competitors, leading to lost pitches worth over $8 million in potential revenue. "How has she never been prosecuted?" I asked, studying a photograph of Penny entering a law office with 2 men in expensive suits. "She's extremely careful about staying just within legal boundaries," Evelyn explained. "Everything she does can be explained as aggressive networking or ambitious career advancement. The companies she's targeted have always chosen to settle quietly, rather than pursue criminal charges, partly because prosecuting corporate espionage cases is expensive, and partly because they don't want to admit how thoroughly they were compromised." But the most interesting revelation was in the final section of the report. Penny wasn't working alone. She was part of a sophisticated network that specialized in infiltrating and destabilizing successful mid-size companies, either to benefit direct competitors or to make them attractive acquisition targets for larger corporations. Morrison Creative has been trying to position themselves for acquisition by Meridian Global for 2 years, Evelyn noted. If they could destabilize or acquire Sterling and Associates, it would give them the market presence they need to attract a billion-dollar buyout offer. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about Quincy's affair, or his desire to replace me professionally. Sterling and Associates was being targeted for corporate warfare, and my husband had unknowingly made himself the perfect inside collaborator. "What's our legal position?" I asked, already calculating my next moves. "Ironclad," Evelyn replied with satisfaction. "The corporate documents I structured give you multiple avenues to protect the company. If you can prove industrial espionage or breach of fiduciary duty, you can take complete control and pursue both criminal and civil remedies." Over the next 3 weeks, I began documenting everything with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. The private investigator I'd hired installed surveillance equipment in the office that was completely legal. As the majority owner, I had every right to monitor activities on company property. The recordings were enlightening and infuriating in equal measure. Penny had indeed been copying client files, photographing strategic documents, and having regular phone conversations with unknown contacts during hours when she thought the office was empty. More damaging, she'd been systematically documenting our financial systems, client payment schedules, and proprietary campaign methodologies. But the surveillance also revealed something I hadn't expected. Quincy genuinely believed he was making smart business decisions. He wasn't consciously participating in corporate espionage. He was simply so blinded by ego and attraction that he couldn't see how thoroughly he was being manipulated. "She's really outdone herself this time," I muttered one evening, reviewing transcripts of their conversations. Penny had convinced Quincy that expanding aggressively and taking on debt to finance new hires would position Sterling and Associates for rapid growth. What she hadn't mentioned was that the strategy would also make us vulnerable to acquisition if the expansion failed. The final piece of intelligence gathering came from an unexpected source. Sam Rodriguez, my former assistant, approached me during my lunch break with information that confirmed my worst suspicions. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," he said nervously, glancing around the small cafe where we'd met. "But something's not right about Penny. She's been asking questions about client contracts, payment terms, things that have nothing to do with her job as an executive assistant." "What kind of questions?" I prompted gently. "Yesterday she wanted to know which clients were up for renewal in the next 6 months, and whether we had any exclusivity clauses that might prevent them from working with competitors. When I asked why she needed that information, she said Quincy was evaluating our competitive vulnerabilities." Sam handed me a flash drive. "I've been keeping copies of everything she's requested access to. I thought maybe you should know, since you built most of these client relationships yourself." That evening, I reviewed Sam's files and realized that Penny had systematically mapped our entire business structure. She knew our profit margins, our client dependencies, our operational costs, and most importantly, our strategic weaknesses. She had everything she needed to either steal our most valuable accounts or sabotage our operations entirely. But I had something she didn't know about: complete legal control of the company and documentation of every move she'd made for the past month. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for her to spring it. Phase 2 of my plan could begin. Over the next 2 months, I became a master of deception, playing the role of the unsuspecting wife while systematically documenting every aspect of Quincy and Penny's conspiracy. The private investigator I'd hired, a former FBI agent named Reese Thompson, provided me with surveillance equipment that was virtually undetectable. "The key to building an airtight case," Reese explained during one of our clandestine meetings in a parking garage downtown, "is redundancy. We need multiple forms of evidence: audio recordings, financial transactions, digital communications, and witness testimony. No single piece should be the linchpin of your case." I took his advice to heart, creating a comprehensive surveillance network that would have impressed intelligence professionals. Tiny cameras were installed in the conference rooms, audio recording devices were placed in strategic locations throughout the office, and most importantly, I gained access to Penny's computer activities through perfectly legal monitoring software that I had every right to install as the company's majority owner. The evidence that accumulated was staggering in its scope and damning in its implications. Within 3 weeks of her official promotion to my former position, Penny had copied over 40,000 client files to external drives. She'd photographed proprietary campaign strategies, documented our pricing structures, and systematically mapped our entire business operation. Most dangerously, she'd begun reaching out to our major clients, ostensibly to strengthen relationships, but actually to position herself as their primary contact when she inevitably moved to a competitor. But the digital espionage was only part of the picture. The audio surveillance revealed conversations that would be devastating in court. "The Hartwell Industries renewal is coming up in 6 weeks. I heard Penny tell someone during a phone call she thought was private. If we can convince them that Sterling and Associates is unstable, they'll be prime targets for acquisition." Maureen's departure creates the perfect narrative: not as key talent, leaving due to management problems. The person on the other end of the call was Marcus Webb from Morrison Creative, confirming my suspicions about the broader conspiracy. "What about the financial analysis you promised?" Marcus asked. "Our acquisition team needs detailed projections if we're going to make a competitive offer." "I've got everything," Penny replied confidently. "Their profit margins, overhead costs, client payment schedules, even their loan obligations. Sterling and Associates is more leveraged than they appear, especially with Quincy's recent expansion plans. If we time this right, we can probably acquire them for 60% of actual value. I sat in my car in the parking garage, listening to this conversation through wireless earbuds, feeling my hands shake with a mixture of rage and vindication. They weren't just stealing information, they were planning to destroy the company I'd built and buy it at a fraction of its worth. But the most damaging evidence came from Quincy himself. The recordings revealed that my husband wasn't just being seduced and manipulated, he was an active participant in the conspiracy, even if he didn't fully understand its implications. Maureen never understood the bigger picture, he told Penny during one of their intimate evening meetings in his office. She thinks in terms of individual campaigns and quarterly profits. She doesn't see the strategic value of market consolidation. That's why she had to go, Penny agreed, her voice taking on that throaty quality I'd learned to associate with manipulation. A company like Sterling and Associates needs leadership that understands how modern business really works. Sometimes you have to sacrifice short-term ethics for long-term success. Exactly. When Morrison makes their acquisition offer, we'll be in the perfect position to negotiate. New leadership, streamlined operations, no dead weight holding us back. Dead weight. That's how my husband described 8 years of marriage and professional partnership. The financial evidence was equally compelling. Through Evelyn's connections, I discovered that Quincy had been secretly meeting with investment advisors, discussing the sale of his shares in Sterling and Associates. He'd even opened a separate bank account, where he was apparently planning to deposit the proceeds from the company's sale. More disturbing, I found evidence that he'd been taking out personal loans against his expected windfall, accumulating debt that would force him to complete the sale regardless of the actual offers received. He's put himself in a position where he has to sell, Evelyn explained, when I brought her the financial documents. Between the loans and the lifestyle inflation, he needs liquid capital within the next 6 months or he'll face bankruptcy. But perhaps the most valuable evidence came from an unexpected source. Jenna Walsh, our head of client services, who had become suspicious of Penny's unusual interest in account details. She keeps asking for information that doesn't relate to her job. Jenna confided during a coffee meeting that I'd arranged to look casual. Yesterday she wanted copies of all our client contracts, including renewal dates and termination clauses. When I asked why, she said Quincy was conducting a strategic review. Did you give her the information? I asked, already knowing the answer would be useful either way. Some of it, but I made copies of everything first. Something didn't feel right about the whole thing. Jenna handed me a flash drive. These are copies of every document she's requested access to. I thought maybe you should know, since most of these accounts were originally yours anyway. The flash drive contained a gold mine of evidence, documented proof of every proprietary file Penny had accessed, complete with timestamps and request justifications that would demonstrate a clear pattern of industrial espionage. By the end of April, I had accumulated enough evidence to destroy both Quincy and Penny in criminal court, civil litigation and professional reputation. Audio recordings of their conspiracy, digital evidence of systematic data theft, financial documentation of their planned betrayal, and witness testimony from multiple employees who had observed suspicious behavior. But I wasn't ready to spring the trap yet. The evidence was comprehensive, but I wanted something more. I wanted them to complete their betrayal publicly, in front of witnesses, in a way that would maximize the humiliation while minimizing any chance of legal challenges or appeals to sympathy. I wanted them to fire me from my own company, believing they held all the power, just moments before discovering that they had walked into a carefully constructed legal and financial ambush. The surveillance had given me everything I needed to destroy them. Now I just had to wait for the perfect moment to reveal that the prey had actually been the predator all along. The final phase of my plan could begin. The moment I discovered the true scope of their conspiracy was both devastating and vindicating. It happened on a Friday evening in late May, 3 weeks before the conference room confrontation that would end my charade as the unsuspecting wife. I'd been working late again, maintaining my pattern of staying after hours to catch up on the consulting work that Quincy had gradually relegated me to. In reality, I was using the empty office to review surveillance footage and download the latest batch of digital evidence from Penny's computer activities. The building was quiet, except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. I was alone in my old office, now officially designated as a consulting workspace, when I heard voices from the conference room. Not Quincy's office this time, but the main meeting space where we conducted client presentations and board meetings. What I heard through the slightly open door changed everything I thought I knew about their betrayal. The timeline has been moved up, a voice I didn't recognize was saying. Male, authoritative, with the kind of crisp diction that suggested expensive education and corporate power. Meridian Global wants to close the acquisition by the end of Q3, which gives us less than 8 weeks to complete the destabilization. I froze, my hand suspended over my laptop keyboard. Meridian Global was one of the largest marketing conglomerates in North America, known for aggressively acquiring smaller firms and stripping them for talent and client lists. That's aggressive, Quincy replied, and I could hear the tension in his voice. We've been planning this for 6 months. Rushing the final phase could expose the whole operation. Your wife's departure creates the perfect window, Penny interjected smoothly. The narrative is already established, key talent leaving due to management instability. If we can trigger a few high-profile client departures in the next month, Sterling and Associates will look like a company in crisis. My wife's departure. They were talking about my termination like it had already happened, like it was an inevitable part of their master plan rather than something they were still building toward. What about the financial pressure? The unknown voice asked. Are Quincy's personal obligations sufficient to force the sale? More than sufficient, Penny confirmed, and I could hear papers rustling. Between the expansion loans and his personal debt, he'll need liquid capital within 60 days or face bankruptcy. The beauty is that he genuinely believes he's making smart business decisions. I carefully moved closer to the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid they might hear it. Through the narrow gap I could see 3 figures around the conference table. Quincy, Penny, and a man in an expensive suit whom I didn't recognize. Marcus Webb sends his regards, the stranger continued. Morrison Creative's board has agreed to the acquisition terms. They'll offer $42 million for Sterling and Associates, which represents about 60% of actual value. After Meridian's acquisition of Morrison, the combined entity will control 70% of the Chicago market. $42 million. For a company that was actually worth closer to $70 million, based on our client base, revenue streams, and market position. They were planning to steal $30 million through strategic manipulation and corporate espionage. What's my guarantee? Quincy asked, and for the first time I heard uncertainty in his voice. If this goes wrong, I lose everything. You're losing everything anyway, the stranger replied bluntly. Your debt obligations ensure that. This way, you walk away with enough money to start over, plus a guaranteed position with Morrison Creative. The alternative is bankruptcy and professional ruin. Plus, Penny added, her voice taking on that seductive quality I'd learned to despise, we'll finally be able to stop pretending. No more sneaking around, no more elaborate deceptions. We can build something real together, something real, built on the destruction of my life's work and the betrayal of everyone who trusted them. The Hartwell Industries presentation is next week, Quincy said, his voice gaining confidence as he bought into their narrative. If we can sabotage that pitch, it'll trigger penalty clauses worth almost $3 million. Combined with the Morrison account defection you've arranged, it should create enough financial pressure to justify the sale. Sabotage. They weren't just planning to steal clients, they were actively planning to destroy our existing relationships to force a distressed sale. Perfect, the stranger said. I'll inform Meridian that we're on schedule. Remember, once this process begins, there's no going back. Every action you take from this point forward is being monitored and documented. The irony was exquisite. They thought they were monitoring and documenting my actions, when in reality, I'd been building a comprehensive case against them for months. What about Maureen? Penny asked. She's smarter than you give her credit for, Quincy. What if she suspects something? Maureen. Quincy laughed, the sound bitter and condescending. She's completely oblivious. Still thinks this is about marital problems and office politics. She has no idea this is a coordinated corporate acquisition strategy. Besides, he continued, even if she did figure it out, what could she do? She's a displaced marketing manager with hurt feelings. Against Meridian Global and Morrison Creative, she'd be crushed. I backed away from the door slowly, my mind racing through the implications of what I'd just learned. This wasn't just about Quincy's affair, or even simple corporate espionage. This was a coordinated attack by two major corporations, using my marriage and my husband's financial desperation as weapons to steal my company. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed I was powerless because they didn't know who I really was. They saw Maureen Sterling, the displaced wife and employee. They had no idea they were targeting Maureen Chen, majority owner and the person who actually controlled Sterling and Associates. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave the office, I realized that their accelerated timeline actually worked in my favor. Instead of having months to plan my counterattack, I now had a definitive deadline and a clear understanding of their complete strategy. They wanted to destroy my company and steal it for a fraction of its value. Perfect. I would let them try, document every move they made, and then reveal that they just attempted to commit corporate fraud against someone with the resources and legal protection to destroy them all. The final confrontation was coming sooner than I'd expected, but I was ready. More than ready, I was looking forward to it. The week following my discovery of the Meridian Global conspiracy was when everything accelerated beyond my carefully controlled timeline. What I had planned as a methodical 6-month operation suddenly became a high-stakes race against corporate predators who were moving faster than I'd anticipated. It started on Monday morning when I arrived at the office to find Penny already at my old desk, going through files that should have been locked away. She looked up with that practiced smile when she saw me. But there was something different in her eyes, a predatory confidence that suggested the final phase of their plan was already in motion. "Good morning, Maureen," she said sweetly, her fingers drumming against a stack of client folders. "I was just reviewing some of the account histories. You really did build some impressive relationships over the years." The past tense wasn't accidental. She was already talking about my work like it was ancient history, something to be studied and discarded. "Anything I can help you with?" I asked, playing my role as the displaced but cooperative former employee. "Actually, yes. Quincy mentioned that you have personal relationships with several of our key accounts. It would be helpful if you could facilitate some transition meetings, just to ensure continuity during this restructuring period." Transition meetings. She wanted me to personally introduce her to the clients I'd spent years cultivating, essentially handing over my professional relationships to the woman who was planning to destroy the company. The audacity was breathtaking, but I smiled and nodded. Of course, whatever's best for the company. What she didn't know was that I'd already contacted every major client personally, not to transition relationships, but to give them a confidential heads-up about potential instability at Sterling and Associates. I'd framed it as a courtesy warning from someone who cared about their interests, suggesting they might want to review their contracts and prepare contingency plans. The responses had been enlightening. 3 clients immediately requested meetings to discuss contract modifications that would protect them from service disruptions. 2 others mentioned that they'd been approached by Morrison Creative with interesting proposals, confirming that the client poaching was already underway. But the most valuable response came from David Chen, the CEO of Hartwell Industries and coincidentally, my second cousin. When I explained the situation during a private dinner at his home, his reaction was everything I'd hoped for. "You're telling me that Sterling and Associates is being targeted for corporate espionage by Morrison Creative, and your husband is involved?" David asked, his expression shifting from family concern to business calculation. "Not just involved, he's the primary inside collaborator. They're planning to sabotage your presentation next week to trigger penalty clauses and destabilize our company for acquisition." David leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "The Hartwell account represents almost 15% of your annual revenue. If we terminated our contract due to service failures, it would seriously damage Sterling and Associates' market position." "Exactly. Which is why I'm asking you to help me set a trap." What we planned was elegant in its simplicity. Hartwell Industries would pretend to be completely satisfied with the upcoming presentation, regardless of how badly Quincy and Penny sabotaged it. But they would also quietly document every aspect of the professional failures, creating a detailed record of deliberate negligence and breach of contract. Meanwhile, I would ensure that the sabotage was captured on the surveillance system I'd installed, providing audio and video evidence of premeditated corporate misconduct. "When this is over," David said as we shook hands, "I want Sterling and Associates to remain Hartwell's primary marketing partner, but I want to be working with someone I can trust." The next escalation came on Wednesday, when I discovered that my access to several computer systems had been quietly revoked. Not dramatically or with explanation, just a gradual restriction of permissions that suggested someone was methodically cutting me out of company operations. When I mentioned this to Sam Rodriguez during our usual coffee break, his expression grew troubled. "That's not the only thing," he said, glancing around nervously. "Penny's been asking questions about your personal files, your client contact lists, even your home address and personal phone numbers. My personal information. Why would she need that?" She said something about ensuring complete transition of responsibility. "But Maureen," Sam lowered his voice. "Yesterday I saw her photocopying documents from your personnel file. Employment contracts, salary history, performance reviews. Why would she need copies of that?" The answer hit me like a cold wave. They weren't just planning to fire me. They were building a case to justify my termination, probably alleging performance issues or breach of contract to avoid severance payments and minimize legal liability. But there was something more sinister in their interest in my personal information. If they were planning to steal clients and proprietary information, they might need to impersonate me in communications or forge documents that would require personal details. That evening, I called Reese Thompson with new instructions. "I need comprehensive protection," I told him. "Home security, personal surveillance, digital monitoring. I think they're moving beyond corporate espionage into identity theft and possible harassment." "What's changed?" Reese asked, his voice immediately shifting into professional mode. "The timeline has accelerated. They're planning to complete their acquisition within 8 weeks, which means they need to eliminate me as a potential threat much faster than originally planned." "Eliminate you how?" "Professionally, personally, legally, whatever it takes to ensure I can't interfere with their plans. I'm not just an obstacle anymore, Reese. I'm a liability they need to neutralize." The surveillance equipment was installed that night, cameras around my house, monitoring software on my personal devices, and a panic button system that would immediately alert both private security and law enforcement if I felt threatened. It seemed excessive until Friday morning, when I found evidence that someone had attempted to access my home computer remotely. The intrusion was sophisticated, but not quite sophisticated enough to avoid detection by the cybersecurity software Reese had installed. They were trying to access your email accounts, financial records, and personal documents, the cybersecurity specialist explained when I called him for analysis. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was a systematic attempt to gather compromising information or plant evidence. Plant evidence. The phrase sent chills through me as I realized how thoroughly they'd escalated their attack. This wasn't just about stealing my company anymore. They were preparing to destroy my reputation and possibly frame me for crimes I hadn't committed. But their escalation had revealed something important. They were afraid of me. Despite their public confidence and careful planning, some part of them recognized that I represented a genuine threat to their scheme. They were right to be afraid. Because while they'd been focusing on eliminating me as an obstacle, I'd been methodically building the legal and financial weapons that would destroy them completely. The final confrontation was coming, and I was more than ready for it. The morning of June 15th started like any other day in my carefully orchestrated charade, but I knew it would be the day Quincy and Penny finally made their move. All the surveillance, all the evidence gathering, all the months of patient planning had led to this moment. I arrived at Sterling and Associates at my usual time, carrying coffee and wearing the navy blue suit that had always been my armor in difficult situations. The office buzzed with its normal energy, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the steady hum of a successful business that most employees had no idea was under siege. But there were subtle differences that only I could detect. Penny's assistant kept glancing at me nervously. Drew Martinez from accounts avoided eye contact when I said good morning. Even the receptionist seemed uncomfortable, her usual bright smile replaced by an awkward nod. They knew something was coming, even if they didn't know exactly what. I settled into my reduced workspace, the small office that had once been a supply closet, where I'd been temporarily relocated during the restructuring. It was a calculated humiliation designed to make me feel unwelcome and encourage my voluntary departure. Instead, I'd used it as the perfect observation post to monitor their activities without seeming suspicious. At exactly 10:30 a.m., Sam Rodriguez appeared in my doorway, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. "Maureen," he said quietly, "Quincy wants to see you in the main conference room." I looked up from my laptop with carefully practiced confusion. Did he say what it was about? Sam shook his head, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. This was it moment, they'd chosen to destroy me publicly, believing they held all the cards. "Should I bring anything?" I asked, maintaining my role as the cooperative employee who had no idea what was coming. Just yourself," Sam replied, and I could hear the sympathy in his voice. Whatever they'd told the staff to expect, it was clearly designed to generate pity for my impending humiliation. I gathered my purse and notebook, moving with deliberate calm. In my bag was a small recording device that would capture everything about to happen, adding to the comprehensive surveillance system I'd installed throughout the building. Every word, every gesture, every moment of their performance would be documented for the legal proceedings to come. The walk to the conference room felt longer than usual, past curious faces and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached. The entire office knew something significant was happening, and they'd all been positioned as witnesses to my disgrace. When I opened the conference room door, the scene was exactly what I'd expected, but somehow still shocking in its calculated cruelty. Quincy sat at the head of the table in his best suit, flanked by Penny on one side and a woman I didn't recognize on the other. Drew Martinez and Jenna Walsh were also present, both looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. "Maureen," Quincy said without preamble, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for disciplinary meetings. "Please sit down. We need to discuss some serious concerns that have come to our attention." I took the chair directly across from him, noting how they'd arranged the seating to create a confrontational dynamic. Me alone on one side, all of them united on the other. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, keeping my voice steady and curious rather than defensive. Penny leaned forward slightly, her expression a masterpiece of false concern. "We've discovered some irregularities in client account management that we need to address immediately." The woman I didn't recognize opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. "I'm Catherine Mills from Human Resources," she said officiously. "These are copies of client communications that raise serious questions about your professional conduct." I glanced at the papers, recognizing them immediately as doctored versions of legitimate emails I'd sent to clients over the past months. Someone had altered the content to make routine business communications appear unprofessional, even potentially damaging to client relationships. "I'm not sure I understand," I said, studying the documents more carefully. "These appear to be my emails, but the content has been modified." "Modified?" Quincy's voice rose with practiced indignation. "Are you suggesting that we've fabricated evidence against you?" "I'm suggesting that these documents don't accurately represent the communications I sent," I replied calmly. "I keep copies of all my client correspondence, and these versions contain language I never used." Penny exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine Mills before speaking. "Maureen, I understand this is difficult to accept, but we have multiple witnesses who can verify the problematic nature of your recent client interactions." "What witnesses?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be carefully coached employees or outright fabrications. "Several clients have expressed concerns about your communications becoming increasingly erratic and unprofessional," Catherine Mills said, consulting her notes. "We have documented complaints about missed deadlines, inappropriate language in emails, and failure to follow established protocols." It was a masterpiece of character assassination, specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to be difficult to disprove. They'd clearly spent considerable time crafting accusations that would justify immediate termination, while making it nearly impossible for me to defend myself effectively. "Furthermore," Quincy continued, his voice gaining momentum, "we've discovered that you've been accessing client files and confidential information without authorization, potentially in violation of your employment agreement and company policy." The accusation was rich with irony, given that Penny had been systematically stealing proprietary information for months. But I could see the strategy. By accusing me of the crimes they were actually committing, they could justify my termination while deflecting attention from their own activities. "I'd like to review these alleged violations," I said, reaching for my purse. I have documentation that should clarify any misunderstandings. That won't be necessary, Catherine Mills interrupted quickly. The evidence is clear and comprehensive. Based on these findings, we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. Additionally, Penny added with barely concealed satisfaction, given the serious nature of these violations, we're unable to provide the standard severance package. The employment agreement allows for immediate termination without compensation in cases of misconduct. I sat back in my chair, letting the moment sink in. They just accused me of corporate misconduct, terminated my employment without cause, and denied me severance pay, all based on fabricated evidence and false accusations. It was exactly what I'd been hoping they would do. I see, I said quietly, my voice containing just the right note of defeated acceptance. I suppose there's nothing more to discuss. I stood slowly, gathering the fabricated documents they'd presented as evidence. I'll clear out my office and return any company property. Security will escort you, Quincy said coldly, standard procedure for terminated employees. As I walked toward the door, I turned back with what I hoped looked like wounded dignity. 8 years of marriage and professional partnership, and this is how it ends. Business is business, Maureen, Quincy replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Personal relationships can't interfere with necessary decisions. I nodded and left the conference room, knowing that every person in that building was watching the apparent destruction of my career and marriage. What they didn't know was that they'd just committed multiple felonies in front of witnesses while being recorded by surveillance equipment that would make their crimes absolutely undeniable in court. The trap had been sprung, and they'd walked into it perfectly. The walk from the conference room to my temporary office felt like a perp walk, with every employee in the building positioned to witness my apparent downfall. I could feel their eyes following me as I moved through the familiar hallways that had been my professional home for 8 years, now transformed into a gauntlet of enforced humiliation. Security was waiting by my desk, 2 guards I'd never seen before, clearly hired specifically for this moment, rather than using the regular building security, who knew me personally. They stood with their arms crossed, projecting an image of authority and mild threat that was designed to make me appear dangerous or untrustworthy. Ma'am, the taller guard said officiously, will need to supervise while you gather your personal belongings. Company policy for terminated employees. I nodded quietly, maintaining the demeanor of someone who was shocked and defeated, rather than someone who had orchestrated this entire scenario. Around me, colleagues pretended to work while obviously listening to every word and watching every movement. The personal items I'd accumulated over 8 years fit into a single cardboard box, a calculated humility that I'd maintained specifically for this moment. No expensive decorations, no obvious displays of wealth or power, nothing that would suggest I was anything more than a dedicated employee who'd been wrongfully terminated. As I packed my few belongings, I could hear whispered conversations around the office. I can't believe they fired her, someone said quietly. Must have been serious if they called security, another voice replied. She seemed so professional, you never know, I guess. The narrative was already forming. Maureen Sterling, the apparently dedicated employee who had been hiding serious professional misconduct. By the end of the day, the story would spread through Chicago's tight-knit marketing community, carefully crafted to damage my reputation and discourage other firms from hiring me. Penny appeared at my desk as I finished packing, her expression a masterpiece of false sympathy mixed with barely concealed triumph. Maureen, I'm sorry it came to this, she said, her voice pitched perfectly for the audience of eavesdropping colleagues. I hope you understand that these decisions are never personal. Of course, I replied quietly, looking up at her with what I hoped appeared to be wounded dignity. I just never imagined that 8 years of dedicated service would end this way. Sometimes people change, Penny said, with a slight shrug, as if my supposed professional deterioration was an unfortunate but inevitable development. What matters now is that you take this as an opportunity to reflect and grow. The condescension was breathtaking. She was standing in my office, having stolen my position through corporate espionage and marital betrayal, offering me life advice about personal growth and professional reflection. You're right, I said, standing and picking up my box of belongings. Perhaps this is exactly what I needed. The double meaning was lost on her, but it gave me satisfaction to speak the truth while maintaining my disguise. Quincy appeared as I reached the elevator, clearly wanting to be seen making the final gesture of dismissal. His face was set in the expression of a corporate executive making difficult but necessary decisions, the kind of performance designed to demonstrate leadership under challenging circumstances. "Maureen," he said formally, extending his hand in a gesture that was supposed to look professional and compassionate. "I want you to know that this decision wasn't made lightly. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." I looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before taking it, noting how his wedding ring caught the light. 8 years of marriage, and he was shaking my hand like I was a stranger he'd just fired for cause. "Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to Sterling and Associates' success," I replied, my voice carrying just the right note of dignified sadness. "I hope the company continues to thrive under its new leadership." The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside with my cardboard box and my security escort. As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of the office I'd helped build, employees standing at their desks, watching the woman they thought had built their creative division being escorted out like a criminal. The lobby was no better. Word had clearly spread throughout the building, and I could feel curious stares from people I'd worked with for years. The receptionist, who had always greeted me warmly, now looked away uncomfortably. The security guards at the main desk watched my procession with professional interest, noting how someone they'd seen as a respected executive was now being treated as a potential threat. "I'll need your building access card and any company property," one of my escorts said as we reached the main exit. I handed over my key card and building pass, noting how he held them like evidence of my former status rather than routine administrative items. Every detail of this interaction was designed to reinforce the narrative that I was no longer welcome, no longer trusted, no longer part of the Sterling and Associates family. The final humiliation came as we stepped outside onto the busy Chicago sidewalk. The timing was perfectly calculated, a lunch hour, when the maximum number of people from neighboring businesses would be visible. Anyone who recognized me would see Maureen Sterling being escorted out of her own building with her belongings in a cardboard box. "Have a good day, ma'am," the security guard said, with dismissive politeness before turning back toward the building. I stood alone on the sidewalk, holding my box of belongings, looking for all the world like another corporate casualty in an unforgiving business environment. Pedestrians hurried past without a second glance, accustomed to seeing well-dressed professionals carrying their careers in cardboard boxes. But as I walked toward my car, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction rather than humiliation. Every moment of this degrading performance had been captured by surveillance equipment that would provide devastating evidence in court. Every false accusation, every fabricated document, every moment of calculated cruelty was now documented proof of a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple workplace misconduct. They thought they had destroyed me publicly, establishing a narrative that would prevent me from challenging their actions or competing with their plans. They believed they had neutralized the only person who posed a genuine threat to their acquisition scheme. What they had actually done was commit multiple felonies in front of witnesses while providing me with everything I needed to take complete control of Sterling and Associates and destroy their lives in return. I placed my cardboard box in the trunk of my car and drove away from the building that housed the company I actually owned, knowing that I would return very soon under very different circumstances. The performance was over. Now the real show could begin. The moment I reached my car, I made the first call that would set the wheels of justice in motion. My hands were steady as I dialed Evelyn Blackwood's direct line, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins from the performance I'd just concluded. "It's done," I said, when she answered on the first ring. "They terminated you." Evelyn's voice was sharp with professional interest. "Terminated me, accused me of corporate misconduct, denied severance, and provided fabricated evidence to justify their actions, all while being recorded by our surveillance system and witnessed by multiple employees. Perfect. That's wrongful termination, defamation, conspiracy to commit fraud, and about 6 other felonies. How long until the board meeting?" I glanced at my watch. 2 hours. "Are you ready?" "I've been ready for months. The emergency board resolution is drafted, the evidence packages are prepared, and I've already filed preliminary injunctions to freeze all corporate assets pending investigation of potential embezzlement. The second call went to Reese Thompson, my private investigator. Time to move, I told him. I need the complete surveillance package delivered to the district attorney's office within the hour, and I want copies of everything sent to the FBI's white-collar crime division. Already in motion, Reese replied with satisfaction. I've been coordinating with federal investigators for the past week. They're very interested in the Morrison Creative Connection and the Meridian Global Conspiracy. Apparently, this fits a pattern they've been tracking across multiple states. My third call was to David Chen at Hartwell Industries. Cousin, I said when he answered, it's time for you to express your concerns about Sterling and Associates' recent management decisions. The board meeting is this afternoon? David asked. Exactly. Your formal complaint about service deterioration and contract violations needs to arrive 30 minutes before the meeting starts. Make sure you mention specific concerns about unauthorized personnel accessing confidential Hartwell information. Consider it done. And Maureen? I've already instructed our legal team to begin reviewing options for contract termination if these management issues aren't resolved immediately. The final piece of my counter strategy involved Sam Rodriguez. I called him on his personal cell, knowing he was probably still at the office processing what he'd just witnessed. Sam, I said when he answered, his voice troubled and confused. Maureen, I can't believe what just happened. Those accusations don't sound like you at all. They're not true, Sam, and I need your help to prove it. Do you still have those copies of everything Penny requested access to? Of course, I've been keeping detailed records because something felt wrong about her requests. Good. In exactly 1 hour, you're going to receive a call from FBI investigators asking about corporate espionage at Sterling and Associates. I need you to tell them the truth about what you observed. There was a pause. FBI? Maureen? What's really going on? Sterling and Associates is being targeted by a corporate acquisition scheme involving Morrison Creative and Meridian Global. Penny isn't just Quincy's secretary, she's a professional infiltrator who's been stealing proprietary information for months. The evidence you collected documents systematic industrial espionage. Jesus, Sam breathed. I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined. Sam, this is important. When the investigators call, tell them exactly what you observed. Every unusual request Penny made, every file she accessed, every time she asked questions that seemed outside her job responsibilities. Your testimony could be crucial in stopping them. What about you? What happens next? I smiled, sitting in my car outside the building that housed my company. What happens next is that I go home, change into my best suit, and return for an emergency board meeting where certain facts about Sterling and Associates' ownership structure are going to become very clear to everyone involved. As I drove away from the office, my phone buzzed with the first of what would be many incoming calls. Word was already spreading through Chicago's business community about my termination, exactly as Quincy and Penny had planned. But the narrative they thought they were controlling was about to shift dramatically. By evening, the story wouldn't be about Maureen Sterling, the disgraced employee who'd been fired for misconduct. It would be about how two corporations had attempted to steal a company through corporate espionage, marital betrayal, and systematic fraud, and how the woman they thought they'd destroyed was actually the person who owned everything they'd tried to steal. The counterattack was beginning, and I had every advantage they didn't know I possessed. At exactly 3 o'clock, I returned to Sterling and Associates, but this time I wasn't alone. I walked through the same lobby where I'd been humiliated just hours earlier, now flanked by Evelyn Blackwood in her most intimidating power suit, and Agent Patricia Collins from the FBI's white-collar crime division. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw me, clearly confused about why someone who'd been escorted out by security was now returning with what was obviously a federal agent and a high-powered attorney. "Good afternoon, Sarah," I said pleasantly to the receptionist. "We're here for the emergency board meeting. Conference room A should be prepared." But you were," Sarah stammered, looking between me and Agent Collins with growing bewilderment. "Terminated this morning." "Yes," I said calmly. "Interesting development, considering I'm the majority shareholder of this company. I believe there may have been some confusion about authority and decision-making protocols." Agent Collins stepped forward, displaying her badge with practiced authority. FBI. We're investigating allegations of corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violations of federal racketeering statutes. This building is now considered part of an active investigation. The lobby fell silent, except for the sound of keyboards stopping and conversations dying mid-sentence. Employees who had witnessed my morning humiliation were now watching federal agents treat me like a person of significant importance rather than a disgraced former employee. We rode the elevator to the executive floor in comfortable silence, but I could feel the building's energy shifting around us. Word was spreading faster than we could move through the hallways. The FBI was here, the woman they'd fired was back, and something major was happening that nobody understood. When we reached the conference room, I could see through the glass walls that Quincy and Penny were already inside, along with several board members who looked increasingly uncomfortable. They'd clearly been discussing how to spin my termination and manage any potential fallout, probably congratulating themselves on removing the last obstacle to their acquisition plan. The expressions on their faces when I walked in were worth every moment of humiliation I'd endured that morning. Quincy's face went white, then flushed red as he struggled to process what he was seeing. "Maureen, what, you can't be here. You were terminated. Security should have Mr. Sterling," Agent Collins interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that stops conversations instantly. "I'm Special Agent Collins, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We're here to discuss some very serious allegations regarding this company's recent management decisions." Penny tried to maintain her composure, but I could see her hands trembling as she clutched her portfolio. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. What allegations? And why is Maureen here if she's no longer an employee?" Evelyn smiled with predatory satisfaction as she placed a thick folder on the conference table. "Miss Clearwater, I'm Evelyn Blackwood, representing Mrs. Chen Sterling's interests as majority owner of Sterling and Associates. She's here because she owns this company, and federal investigators are here because you've been committing felonies against her for the past 6 months." Majority owner, Drew Martinez spoke up from his seat at the table, his voice confused. "But Quincy owns the company. He started it with Maureen's help, but..." "Actually," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table, "the position I should have occupied all along. I founded Sterling and Associates using my inheritance and structured the ownership through protective LLCs. Quincy has been the operational CEO, but I've always been the controlling shareholder." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the original corporate documents, the ones that Evelyn had drafted 12 years ago, and that neither Quincy nor anyone else in the room had ever bothered to examine carefully. According to these documents, Evelyn explained, distributing copies to the stunned board members, Mrs. Chen Sterling holds 51% of voting shares, with automatic conversion to 75% in cases of management misconduct or attempts to remove her without cause. "That's impossible," Penny said, her voice rising with desperation. "Quincy would have known. He would have told me." "Told you what, exactly?" Agent Collins asked, her notebook already open. "What was Mr. Sterling supposed to tell you about the company's ownership structure?" The room fell silent as everyone realized what Penny had just revealed, that she and Quincy had been discussing the company's ownership in contexts that had nothing to do with her legitimate job responsibilities. "I think," I said quietly, looking directly at my husband for the first time since returning, "it's time for everyone to understand exactly what's been happening here and why federal investigators are now involved." Quincy's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his face cycling through emotions from shock to anger to what looked like the beginning of genuine fear. The moment of revelation had arrived, and I had never felt more powerful in my life. The silence in the conference room was deafening as I opened the folder containing 12 years of carefully maintained corporate documents. Every person at the table was about to discover that everything they thought they knew about Sterling and Associates was based on an elaborate fiction that I had maintained to protect my interests. "Let me start with the basics," I said, my voice steady and professional as I distributed copies of the original incorporation papers. "On March 15, 12 years ago, I invested $4.7 million of my inheritance to establish Sterling and Associates. The company was structured through Chen Family Holdings LLC to protect my privacy and assets. Quincy's face had gone completely white. That's impossible. I started this company. You helped me get a business loan, but I was the founder. You never got a business loan, Quincy, I replied calmly. The money came from my trust fund, channeled through investment vehicles that my attorney structured to look like traditional business financing. I let you believe you were the founder because I wanted a partner, not an employee. Evelyn placed additional documents on the table. These are the quarterly financial reports that Mrs. Chen Sterling has received as majority shareholder for the past 12 years. Every major business decision, every significant expenditure, every strategic initiative has been subject to her approval. Drew Martinez picked up one of the documents, his hands shaking slightly. Maureen, you mean, when we discussed budget allocations and campaign strategies, you weren't just giving suggestions. I was protecting my investment, I said. Every client account you thought Quincy landed through his charm and business acumen. I provided the market research, the competitive analysis, and the strategic positioning. Most of our major victories were based on intelligence I gathered, and plans I developed. Penny had been silent during this revelation, but now she spoke up with desperate defiance. Even if that's true, it doesn't change what happened this morning. Quincy had the authority to terminate you as an employee, regardless of your investment status. Agent Collins looked up from her notes with professional interest. Miss Clearwater, how exactly would you know what authority Mr. Sterling had regarding personnel decisions? That seems like an unusual area of expertise for an executive assistant. The trap was closing, and Penny was walking directly into it. I was just present during discussions about company management, Penny stammered. What kind of discussions? Agent Collins pressed. And with whom? I decided it was time to reveal the scope of what we knew. Agent Collins, I think Miss Clearwater is referring to her conversations with Marcus Webb from Morrison Creative and representatives from Meridian Global regarding their planned acquisition of Sterling and Associates. The effect was electric. Several board members gasped audibly. Drew Martinez dropped his coffee cup, and Quincy looked like he might actually faint. Those conversations, I continued, in which she discussed stealing proprietary client information, sabotaging existing contracts, and timing my termination to destabilize the company for acquisition at below market value. That's a lie, Penny exploded, jumping to her feet. You can't prove any of that. I smiled and nodded to Evelyn, who produced a tablet and began playing audio recordings. Penny's own voice filled the room, crystal clear and utterly damning. The Hartwell Industries renewal is coming up in 6 weeks. If we can convince them that Sterling and Associates is unstable, they'll be prime targets for acquisition. The color drained from Penny's face as she realized the full scope of what I'd been recording. We have 6 months of surveillance footage, audio recordings, and digital evidence, Agent Collins said, matter-of-factly. Industrial espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, and violation of federal computer crime statutes. Miss Clearwater, you're looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. But I was just, Penny's voice trailed off as she realized there was no explanation that would save her. I turned to look at Quincy directly for the first time since entering the room. And you, my dear husband, are facing charges of conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, and embezzlement. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you taking out personal loans against company assets you don't actually own? Quincy's mouth moved soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to speak. Maureen, I never meant I thought I was making smart business decisions. I didn't know about the ownership structure. You didn't know because you never bothered to read the documents you signed, I replied. You were so eager to play the successful CEO that you never questioned where the money was coming from, or who was really making the strategic decisions. The room fell silent again as the full magnitude of the situation settled over everyone present. The company they'd all worked for, the man they'd thought was their boss, the success story they'd been part of building it had all been an elaborate performance, and they were just now learning who had actually been directing the show. So what happens now? Drew asked quietly. I looked around the table at the faces of people I'd worked alongside for years, people who were just beginning to understand how thoroughly they'd been deceived, by me, by Quincy, and by the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed everything we'd built. Now, I said, we clean house and rebuild this company the right way. Agent Collins opened her own laptop and connected it to the conference room's projection system. Now that we've established the actual ownership structure of this company, let's review the evidence we've gathered regarding the conspiracy to steal it. The first image that appeared on the screen was a surveillance photo of Penny photographing client files after hours. Her face clearly visible in the infrared lighting. Several board members gasped at the obvious nature of the industrial espionage. This photograph was taken on May 23 at 11:15 p.m., Agent Collins said, matter-of-factly. Miss Clearwater is shown copying proprietary client information, including contract terms, pricing structures, and strategic campaign plans. That's not what it looks like, Penny protested weakly. I was just reviewing files for legitimate business purposes. At 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, I asked with raised eyebrows, when you had no authorized access to those particular files in the first place. Agent Collins clicked to the next slide, revealing a detailed financial analysis. Over the past 6 months, Miss Clearwater accessed and copied over 47,000 confidential documents. Computer forensics show these files were transferred to external drives and uploaded to encrypted servers registered to Morrison Creative. The evidence was overwhelming and methodically presented. Screenshots of copied files, timestamps showing after-hours access, email communications with Morrison Creative employees, and financial records proving payments from Meridian Global to accounts associated with Penny's network. But the most damaging evidence, Evelyn said, taking control of the presentation, comes from audio surveillance that Mrs. Chen Sterling legally installed as the property owner. The conference room speakers came alive with crystal-clear recordings of conversations between Quincy, Penny, and the mysterious Meridian Global representative. Every word of their conspiracy was laid bare. They planned sabotage of client relationships, the deliberate financial pressure on Quincy, and the scheme to acquire Sterling and Associates for 60% of its actual value. Drew Martinez was visibly shaken as he listened to discussions about destabilizing the company he'd devoted his career to. Quincy, how could you participate in this? These people are our friends, our colleagues. I didn't realize, Quincy began, then stopped as another recording played his own voice. Maureen's departure creates the perfect narrative. Key talent leaving due to management problems will make the acquisition look justified. You didn't realize you were planning to destroy the livelihoods of 53 employees, I asked quietly. You didn't realize you were stealing a company that I built with my own money. The next section of evidence focused on the fabricated documents used to justify my termination. Side-by-side comparisons showed the original emails I'd sent to clients alongside the doctored versions presented as evidence of misconduct, document forgery, defamation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Agent Collins noted clinically, each charge carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. Jenna Walsh, who had been silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke up. The Hartwell account, Penny said she was conducting relationship management, but she was actually trying to steal them. Attempting to steal them, I corrected. Fortunately, Hartwell Industries was cooperative in documenting the attempted client poaching and contract interference. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from David Chen, formal complaint filed with the Better Business Bureau and State Attorney General's office. Morrison Creative's illegal client solicitation practices are now under investigation. The final piece of evidence was perhaps the most damning: Pensy financial records showing Quincy's personal debt obligations and the loans he'd taken against company assets he didn't own. Mr. Sterling accumulated over $200,000 in personal debt, based on his expected proceeds from selling Sterling and Associates, Agent Collins explained. This created a financial dependency that made him vulnerable to manipulation and willing to participate in illegal activities. I was trying to position the company for growth, Quincy said desperately. The expansion plans, the new hires, the market positioning. I thought I was being strategic. You were being used, I replied bluntly. Every decision you thought was brilliant strategy was actually designed to make Sterling and Associates vulnerable to acquisition. The debt, the expansion, the personnel changes, it was all part of their plan to destabilize the company. The presentation concluded with a comprehensive timeline, showing how the conspiracy had unfolded over 6 months. From Penny's initial infiltration to the morning's termination meeting, every move had been documented, every conversation recorded, every financial transaction traced. The evidence is overwhelming and indisputable, Evelyn summarized. We have multiple federal crimes, extensive documentation and cooperation from several witnesses including company employees and client organizations. Agent Collins closed her laptop and looked directly at Penny and Quincy. Based on this evidence, we're prepared to file federal charges that could result in decades of prison time. However, cooperation with our ongoing investigation into the broader corporate espionage network could potentially influence sentencing recommendations. The room fell silent as the full weight of their situation became clear. They weren't just facing termination or civil lawsuits, they were looking at federal prison time and the complete destruction of their personal and professional lives. And I was just getting started. As the devastating evidence presentation concluded, I could see the shock and disbelief spreading beyond just Quincy and Penny to the other employees, who were beginning to understand the full scope of what had been happening under their noses. Sam Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, having been summoned by Agent Collins to provide his witness testimony. His face was pale but determined as he entered the conference room carrying a box of documents. "Sam," I said gently, "please tell everyone what you observed over the past few months regarding Penny's activities." Sam's voice was steady despite his obvious nervousness. Penny requested access to files that had nothing to do with her job: client contracts, financial records, competitive analysis reports. When I asked why she needed them, she always said Quincy had authorized it for strategic planning. He placed several folders on the table, but I kept copies of everything because it felt wrong. She was particularly interested in our most valuable accounts and kept asking about contract renewal dates and termination clauses. Drew Martinez looked stricken as he processed Sam's testimony. The client relationship reviews we've been conducting were those part of this. Every piece of client intelligence we gathered was being fed to Morrison Creative. I confirmed. They knew our pricing, our strategies, our vulnerabilities. That's how they were able to make such competitive offers to steal our accounts. Jenna Walsh spoke up, her voice trembling with anger. "The Hartwell presentation that we've been preparing for weeks, was that going to be sabotaged too?" Agent Collins nodded grimly. "We have recordings of plans to deliberately deliver substandard work to trigger penalty clauses worth $3 million. The goal was to create financial pressure that would force a distressed sale." The room erupted in shocked murmurs as employees realized how close they'd come to losing everything. These weren't just abstract corporate machinations, this was an attack on their livelihoods, their careers, their professional family. "But it gets worse," I said, silencing the room. "This wasn't just about stealing Sterling and Associates. According to FBI intelligence, this is part of a broader pattern targeting successful mid-size marketing firms across the Midwest." Agent Collins opened another file. "Morrison Creative, backed by Meridian Global, has attempted similar acquisitions in Detroit, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis. In each case, they used professional infiltrators to destabilize target companies before acquiring them at below-market prices." "How many other companies?" Drew asked, his face ashen. 7 confirmed cases over the past 3 years, Agent Collins replied. "Combined value of approximately $400 million in assets acquired through fraud and corporate espionage." The magnitude of the conspiracy was staggering. We weren't just victims, we were part of a systematic corporate warfare campaign designed to consolidate the entire regional marketing industry under Meridian Global's control. "The good news," Evelyn interjected, "is that Sterling and Associates was the first target where the infiltration was detected and documented in real time. Your evidence is helping federal investigators build cases against the entire network." I looked around the table at the faces of people who had devoted years of their lives to building something meaningful, only to discover they'd been targeted for destruction by corporate predators. "Everyone in this room deserves to know the truth," I said firmly. "You've been working for a company that I founded and funded, managed by a man who didn't understand his own authority, and targeted by criminals who wanted to steal everything we've built together. What happens to us now?" Sam asked quietly. I smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "Now we rebuild Sterling and Associates as it was always meant to be, an employee-owned cooperative where everyone shares in the success they help create." The moment of reckoning had arrived. Agent Collins placed her hands flat on the table and looked directly at Quincy and Penny with the cold professionalism of someone who had seen this type of corruption countless times before. Mr. Sterling, Miss Clearwater, you have exactly one opportunity to cooperate fully with our investigation, she said. We want the complete network, Modders, every contact at Morrison Creative, every Meridian Global representative, every other company that's been targeted. Penny's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand, she said, desperately, her voice rising to near hysteria. I wasn't the mastermind. I was just following orders. Marcus Webb promised me a senior position at Morrison Creative if I could deliver Sterling and Associates. Following orders to commit federal crimes, Agent Collins replied without sympathy. That's not a defense, Miss Clearwater. That's a confession. Quincy had been silent for several minutes, staring at the documents that proved his complete ignorance of his own company's structure. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Maureen, he said, looking at me with what might have been genuine remorse for the first time in months. I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was protecting the company, building something bigger. You thought you were getting rid of an inconvenient wife, I replied coldly. You thought you could steal my company and run away with your secretary to start a new life funded by corporate espionage. That's not, he began, then stopped as he realized there was no version of the truth that made his actions defensible. Quincy, I continued, my voice steady and final, in 8 years of marriage you never once asked to see the corporate documents. You never questioned where the startup money came from. You never wondered why my suggestions were always implemented exactly as I proposed them. I stood up and walked around the table to face him directly. You didn't want a partner. You wanted an audience for your performance as a successful businessman. Well, congratulations. You've given the performance of a lifetime. Penny made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. The charges against me are based on circumstantial evidence, she said, trying to project confidence she clearly didn't feel. Good lawyers can create reasonable doubt about my intentions. I smiled and nodded to Evelyn, who produced one final document. Miss Clearwater, Evelyn said with satisfaction. You might be interested to know that as of this morning, you're also facing civil lawsuits from Hartwell Industries, Chen Family Holdings, and Sterling and Associates for damages totaling $47 million. $47 million. Penny's face went white. The estimated value of the proprietary information you stole, the contracts you attempted to sabotage, and the reputational damage you caused, I explained. Even if you avoid federal prison, you'll be financially destroyed for the rest of your life. The room fell completely silent as the full scope of their destruction became clear. They hadn't just lost their jobs or their schemes, they had lost everything. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where my professional execution had been planned, but everything had changed. The space had been completely renovated, with new furniture arranged in a circle rather than the hierarchical layout that had symbolized the old power structure. Around the table sat the employee owners of the newly restructured Sterling and Associates, reviewing quarterly reports that showed record profits and unprecedented client satisfaction. The cooperative model I'd implemented had transformed not just our financial performance, but our entire company culture. The Hartwell Industries campaign exceeded projections by 30%, Sam Rodriguez reported in his new role as creative director. They've already committed to a 3-year extension and referred 2 major accounts to us. Drew Martinez, now our chief operating officer, smiled as he presented the financial summary. Revenue is up 47% since the restructuring. Turns out that when employees own equity in the company's success, they work like they actually care about the results. The transformation had been more dramatic than I dared to hope. When I revealed my ownership structure and offered to convert Sterling and Associates to an employee cooperative, the response was overwhelming. Every member of our team chose to stay and become an owner-operator, rather than seek employment elsewhere. We'd hired carefully to replace the positions left vacant by Quincy and Penny's departure, focusing on candidates who valued collaboration over competition and long-term relationship building over short-term exploitation. The legal proceedings had concluded exactly as predicted. Penny was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for racketeering, corporate espionage and conspiracy to commit fraud. The civil judgments against her totaled $63 million, ensuring she would never financially recover. Quincy received a lighter sentence of 5 years in federal prison after cooperating fully with investigators and testifying against the Morrison Creative Network. Our divorce was finalized 3 months ago, with a settlement that left him with enough money to start over but not enough to live extravagantly. Morrison Creative was dissolved by federal order, with Meridian Global facing hundreds of millions in damages across 7 states. Marcus Webb and the entire leadership team were prosecuted under RICO statutes for operating a criminal enterprise. But the most satisfying outcome was personal rather than legal. I no longer had to hide who I was, or pretend to be less capable than I actually was. Sterling and Associates now operated with complete transparency, shared ownership, and collective decision-making. Any new business? I asked, concluding our quarterly meeting. Jenna Walsh raised her hand with a grin. I have a proposal from Chen Family Holdings about expanding our sustainable marketing division. I laughed, still adjusting to having my family name associated openly with the business I'd built. I'll consider it, but only if the employee owners approve the expansion plan. As the meeting ended and my colleagues filed out, I remained alone in the conference room for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. They had tried to make Penny my replacement, believing they could steal everything I'd built through deception and betrayal. Instead, they had given me the perfect opportunity to reveal who I really was and create something even better than what they'd tried to destroy. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming who you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.